Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the February Core Advocates webinar. Tonight, we'll be busting some math modeling myths with all of you. We're going to wait just a couple of minutes to get started so we can allow a few more people to get logged on and settled in. So if you haven't already, we would encourage you to download the handouts while you're waiting using the Handouts tab. And also while we're waiting, we're going to put up a little poll for you to respond to. So take a moment there and thank you. We'll be starting in just a couple minutes. Good evening. If you're just joining us, we would love for you to respond to this poll we have up, and we're going to get started with the webinar in just about one more minute. So answer the poll, and then if you want to download the handout that we have for tonight's webinar, and we'll start in another minute. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much for taking our poll. And it looks like this, for the majority of participants tonight, this is their first Core Advocate webinar. We welcome you into the space and hope that you take back lots of learning. And for people who've joined us before, we are ecstatic to see you again.
All right, thanks, Janelle. And thanks again, everybody, for joining us on tonight's Core Advocates webinar. Our topic tonight is math modeling myths, and we're excited to share some great information and great expertise of some guest core advocates tonight. My name is Joni Funderburk, and I am the Manager of Professional Learning on the Field Impact Team at Student Achievement Partners. And I'm joined tonight by other members of the Field Impact Team, Linda Nguyen, Jenny Beltramini, Janelle Fan, and Sandra Alberti. In addition, we have three special guest core advocates tonight, Sarah Galasso, Amy Spees, and Karen McPherson. And I know you're going to learn a lot from these fabulous women tonight. So for those of you who are new tonight on your first webinar, again, welcome. We're excited to have you. If you aren't familiar with the Core Advocates Network, we are a network of over 13,000 educators who believe in and advocate for high quality standards, instructional materials, and assessments that prepare all students for college and careers. The network is well connected and is a great resource for learning and collaboration. And if you're not already a core advocate, we really encourage you to join this fantastic network. You can learn more about the network by contacting me or my colleague Jenny Beltramini directly. Our emails are here for your reference. Also, we encourage you to complete your core advocate profile using this link, achievethecore.org/CA-signup. That's on our Achieve the Core website. Because you signed up for this webinar, you've been added to our mailing list, and you have the option to unsubscribe at any time, but we're certain you're going to love the information that you get from Student Achievement Partners. And we encourage you finally to visit our website, achievethecore.org, for additional information and lots of great opportunities within our network. We know that many of you are active on Twitter and use it as a great resource for professional learning. We encourage you to tweet with us both during and after tonight's webinar using hashtag #CoreAdvocates. Be sure to follow Student Achievement Partners on Twitter @AchieveTheCore. And we've also included the individual Twitter handles of those of us on the webinar tonight, so you can tag us in your tweets and connect with us after the webinar as well. We work to make our webinars interactive for all of you. So we will be asking you to engage with us tonight in several different ways. If you haven't already, please take a moment to download the 3 handouts for tonight's webinar. This will give you easy reference to some of the important components of tonight's webinar and reference for afterwards. We will also be asking some questions during the webinar, and you can respond using the questions tab on your control panel. Feel free to use that tab for any other questions you have during the webinar as well. We'll be monitoring that throughout tonight. We'll also be asking you to engage with some polls, and as you saw at the beginning, as we were waiting to get started, the polls will just pop up on your screen for you to participate. After tonight's webinar, you will receive a survey, and we greatly appreciate you taking the time to complete the surveys. We look over those very carefully and utilize your feedback to help us make our webinars even better from month to month. And then you'll also receive within a day or two access to the recording of tonight's webinar, as well as the slide deck and all of the handouts that we'll be using. So we encourage you to share the resources that you learned tonight and even the recording of the webinar with your colleagues who might not be able to join us. So all that business finished, let's go ahead and get started. Our specific goals for tonight's webinar are these 3. We hope that as a result of attending, you will have a better understanding of what is meant by model with mathematics, that standard for mathematical practice 4. We hope that you will develop an understanding of the progression of mathematical modeling across grade levels. And you'll also have the chance to hear how educators are using these ideas in their classrooms. So let's start with that first goal and get really clear on what is meant by model with mathematics. And to kick us off, I'm going to turn it over to our first guest core advocate, Sarah Galasso.
Thanks, Joni. It's a pleasure to be here tonight with all of the core advocates. I'm Sarah Galasso. I was a math teacher in the Anaheim Union High School District in California for almost 15 years. And during my time there, I focused on building student capacity in the areas of problem solving, critical thinking, and communication, really the heart and soul of the standards for mathematical practice. And now I'm a manager of school partnerships with Carnegie Learning, where I get to take that passion and utilize that across the country as I help teachers grow in those areas and support student capacity in problem solving, critical thinking, and communication. So very excited to share this with everybody tonight. The word model is a very interesting word, and it has a lot of different meanings, and that provides a challenge for us. So as we kick things off in your question tab, just answer the question, what do you think of when you hear the word model?
Great. I'm seeing lots of good responses coming in. Some of the responses that I see are show your thinking, pictorial or visual model, sometimes a representation using objects or manipulative, even explaining thinking using words. So lots of different ideas of what you all think the word model means or what comes to mind when you hear the word model.
I even saw somebody say airplane.
Yeah, those are definitely some great examples of what we think about when we hear the word model. And modeling, as we see in those examples, is a word with many different meanings, especially in mathematics. So in math, it could be an instructional strategy where students are shown how to do a task or students are showing how to do a task. That's one meaning of the word model. Additionally, it could be the use of manipulatives. I am using manipulatives to represent a math situation, so I'm modeling with the manipulatives. That's another meaning that's very common for a lot of us. We also talk about it in terms of creating a representation to a problem or situation, and that's another way that we think about the word model. It was really interesting to hear somebody say an airplane model. Another one that comes up multiple times with participants is this idea of a model with mathematics, so like a supermodel that's out there. That's another meaning of the word model. But really tonight what we want to do is we want to focus on the idea of modeling with mathematics. And as we talk about model with mathematics, it's important for us to realize and understand that we're using math to model the world, not using the world to model the math. So we really want to focus in on that and think about what does it mean to model with mathematics. So in thinking about that, a couple of non-examples that we might see in our text as we're working with students, or words that we might come across and our students might come across, are there on the screen for you. Just take 30 seconds to look at that and think about what type of outcome would you have, or how are you engaging with the mathematics. Feel free to share that in your question box. And now we're going to take a look. So when we see, as we think about that, all I'm doing when I do those problems is I'm just coming up with a representation. It's not very deep. There's not a lot else that's going into it. Now let's go ahead and take a look at an example that would illustrate modeling with mathematics. And just take a moment and think about how are students going to interact with the mathematics in this problem? How are they using it to help them understand the world around them? And if you have some thoughts, please feel free to share those in the question box. So in contrast, as we think about this problem, there's a little bit more unknown in this problem. There's not a clear path or strategy to get to that final solution with the dimensions of the table. And there are multiple answers that students could come up with that would satisfy the conditions for this problem. So it's important for us to continue to remember the differences as we're looking at tasks and we're analyzing tasks to determine if we are addressing the standard for mathematical practice around modeling with mathematics. One other useful tool for me as I'm thinking about modeling with mathematics and what does that look like is to go back to the elaboration documents and really dig into what is the intention of modeling with mathematics. And the elaboration document is available for you in your handouts, the full text of that, so that you can see that. But there are a couple of key things that I always look to, and those are the verbs that I can find within the elaboration. So the idea of applying the mathematics that they know, the first thing I look for is, are students applying mathematics as they're working to solve those problems in everyday life? The next thing I typically look for are assumptions and approximation. Are students making assumptions? Are they making approximations? Are they realizing that they might need to go back and revise those, that what they came up with may not be the best fit for that situation and there needs to be some revision that happens? Those are some other verbs I look for. The next one, identify. Are my students being asked to identify important quantities in that practical situation? So that's another verb that's really important to that modeling with mathematics process. Analyze is another key verb that we find there. We want students not just to come up with the answer, but to analyze their relationships, analyze their response, and use that to draw some conclusions. And then lastly, as we look at this, interpret is that last and final verb that we think about. How are students taking that outcome, that conclusion, and interpreting those mathematical results into the context of the situation? So those are some big key verbs that we want to look at as we're thinking about model with mathematics. And I have these highlighted for myself, and you guys can highlight these as well so that I can go back and reference them and ask myself those questions.
Great. So now we have a poll. Which of the statements describe modeling as meant by math practice number 4? And it looks like the most popular answer was that modeling with mathematics progresses across grades. Thanks.
All right, some interesting thoughts on that poll that I think Sarah will have some comments about some of those things, misconceptions and things that are accurate or partly accurate. So let's go into the second part of tonight's webinar and talk about how modeling with mathematics looks different at the different grade levels. So I think I'll just point out, Sarah, one of the misconceptions on that previous poll is that modeling is only for middle and high school, and that's actually a misconception. Students at elementary school should be modeling too. So why don't you tell us about that?
Yes, thanks, Joni. And that's definitely a big misconception that modeling with mathematics is only done in middle school and high school, when really modeling with mathematics is done from kindergarten all the way up through college. And as we think about modeling with mathematics and what that looks like, it helps us to better understand the progression and the growth that's happening with this particular standard for mathematical practice. One of the key areas that we see that growth is in the idea of constraints. And as we look back and think about that elaboration, it talks about students recognizing and identifying important quantities in a practical situation. And those important quantities, those variables, those are the constraints of the problem. In elementary school, students get very minimal constraints. Maybe it's one or two things that can change or that they really have to focus on in those important quantities. And those are all identified for students. In middle school, we're now looking at multiple constraints. Most of those constraints are identified, but there may be one or two that students have to pull out from the situation. In high school, there are going to be multiple constraints as well, but at the high school level now, we're talking about most of those being unidentified. So those important quantities are things that those high school students have to pull out of that contextual problem and figure out and identify as they're working with that task. So if we think about this and we go back to an example from elementary school is this one right here. So go ahead and take a look at this problem about George and his new bike and think about what are the constraints that you see in this problem. And you can go ahead and type some of those thoughts into the question box. So I see that some of you have picked up on the constraints being the amount of money that George needs to buy his bike and the amount of time that he has to save up for his bike. And those are two of the constraints that we see, and those are clearly stated in the problem as students have those dollar values and that length of time. So as we're looking at the constraints and how students interact with those constraints will develop from kindergarten all the way up through high school. Another important differentiator that grows from elementary through high school is that assumptions are being made. So in elementary, again, all relevant information is given. Students don't have to make many assumptions about the values or the things that they need. In middle school, some of the relevant information is given, but students have to make one or two assumptions, and they need to be identified within the context of that problem. In high school, multiple assumptions are being made, and the high school students have to identify all of those. They have to figure out what are the values, what do I need to think about as they look at their task and try to come up with that final conclusion. So if we go back to that question about George and his bike, we can clearly see that there are some assumptions being made in this problem. And so when you think about George, we as adults typically assume, or we assume the problem is asking us to come up with a plan where George is saving the same amount of money every week. But it doesn't have to happen that way. We're making an assumption. And students will also make that assumption that either George is saving an equal amount of money each week or that George is saving a lot at the beginning and gets to buy the bike early. Those are different assumptions that our elementary students can make. But here's another example that looks at a middle school task. Just go ahead and take a minute and read through this middle school task and see if you can figure out how is this different. So what we can see in this problem, we're still given some information. It's a rectangular floor. We're given the dimensions of the floor, but now we're being asked as middle school students, what information do we need to know to determine how much it's going to cost? So students have to make some assumptions about the size of the tile, the cost of the tile. Are they using any other materials? Do they need glue? And those are the things that we want them to draw out, the information we want them to find. We may give them that information once they've established that this is what I need to know, or we may help them identify those things and then have them go out and search and come up with reasonable estimates or approximations for those values so that they could then figure out the cost of the floor. As we look at this, though, it's important for us to remember that modeling with mathematics is a process, and that we want students to move through this process fluidly as they get more and more comfortable with modeling with mathematics. This process also varies by grade level. So just taking a quick look, we start with the problem. It's in context. We need to formulate or decontextualize what's happening there so that we can compute and come to a conclusion. We're then going to interpret and validate and report that back out. So in thinking about this, it leads to the idea that problems can be of varying levels of complexity. And that complexity is going to change grade level by grade level. So if we're thinking elementary, those problems are going to be relatively straightforward. And what I mean by that is that in elementary school, they're still going to engage in that full process, but they may not need to go back and revise their assumptions. They can just move straight through the problem. And we want them to have that linear feel because we want them to develop their skills and perseverance and stamina for mathematics. In middle school, the problem increases in complexity, meaning that they go through that cycle a little bit more. So they may need to go back and revise their assumptions that they made once they validate and find out that that solution may not be the most accurate. In high school, and thinking beyond, even into the real world, what we do in college and as community members, that problem becomes much more complex. Students will potentially need to validate and revise their strategies multiple times. And when we think about what happens after school, after high school ends, when we get into college and into our careers, that process may never end until we have to present a solution to somebody. We might continually go back and revise, or even present that conclusion and go back and revise. So when we think about those different aspects, it really helps to draw our focus in on that problem complexity. So if we look back at our elementary example with George, students may come up with just a single solution and go through this problem very linearly and have a savings plan for George. Going back to our problem with tiling the floor, students may go and decide, you know what, instead of using 6-inch by 6-inch tile, I think it makes more sense to use a foot by a foot. And they'll go back and they'll revise this based on that information and changing their assumptions. Looking at high school now, getting a high school example, for those of you that know me from outside of my work, you know I love to scuba dive. So we have a problem here where there's a question about weights and the type of weights. Just go ahead and take a minute and think about the complexity of this problem and what are the different things you may go back and revise. Please feel free to put those into the question box. So in looking at this, there's a lot of different ways that students can go. Are they going to use all quarters? Does that make sense? Do they want to use a combination of quarters and nickels and dimes? Or do they want to bring in pennies or do half and half? There's a lot of opportunity for students to come to a conclusion and then go back and revise that and see if that was really the best solution or if there's something else that's going to provide a better option. So as we're looking at these problems and we're seeing that level of complexity come across, we can see how it puts us in this never-ending cycle that we just keep going through until we have to report something out.
All right, thanks, Sarah. You've given us a lot of really meaty stuff to think about in terms of modeling with mathematics. So we're going to pause here, and Janelle has a question for our audience.
I sure do. How are you thinking differently about math modeling? Please use the question box in your control panel to answer.
Right, we're seeing some great responses and some of these math modeling myths debunked. Some of you are talking about realizing that modeling is going to be scaffolded across the grade levels. It needs to be done more frequently in the classroom. Multiple entry points is a nice way to think about good mathematical modeling problems. Great. So please continue to share your thinking with us via the question box, and we'll be sharing out those responses across the whole group as well. So now that Sarah's given us some background, let's take a moment and hear from some of our guest educators who are using these ideas on math modeling in their own classrooms. So first up is Amy C.
Hello, everyone. I am currently teaching fourth graders in a Title I beachside school. This is my 20th year teaching. I spent about 8 of those years teaching middle grades math, but have since returned to teaching all subjects at a fabulous elementary school. And I'm hoping to continue to learn and grow with you all this evening. So as we think about what Sarah mentioned earlier, looking at the elaborations and the complexity of the end result, what we want students to be able to do by the time they leave high school, that can be daunting for elementary teachers. So we want to try and look at this as a progression. How can we help our students at the elementary grades so that they are successful as they move on through their education? And I've noticed that students at first really struggle to see math as a means to solve complex real-world problems. Often they see math as just something you do or procedures to follow. They typically end with the compute stage of the process and think, that's it, I'm finished, that's all I need to do. The question becomes then, how do we help young children see that math is really so much more? So I really try to engage students in tasks for conceptually based lessons to help expand their view of math and to really help move students into other components of the math modeling process. A really powerful tool that I've incorporated is Japanese-inspired math journals. The task is added, and then the students explore the task by first identifying what they know about the situation and what they need to find. They then jot down a plan that will help them accomplish this task. This becomes a starting point to help students recognize that math can be used to solve challenging real-world situations. Students have some independent think time to compute to try and find a solution. The rest of the process is accomplished as students share their thinking, and the task is debriefed as a class. As students share their strategies with their teammates and come to consensus on a strategy to share and defend to the entire, and then defend that to the entire class. During this debrief portion of the lesson, students report their strategies and conclusions and are engaged in interpreting other strategies, relating their solutions back to the task while being prompted to recontextualize. So at this point, I really feel like students are also engaging in math practice too. They've had to look at that situation, pull all the mathematics out, model with that mathematics, and now make sense of it back related to the context. Students also begin to see how different approaches can be taken to tackle these challenging situations, and those strategies that are really getting to the heart of the math lesson's goals are posted on our anchor charts. So here's just a couple examples of showing that process, including the student work that they had worked on together as teams. Once we've identified some strategies that really did meet the needs of the lesson, and the anchor charts are updated, then the students will actually record those strategies in their journals in addition to the work they've already shown. This is helping them see how others have used math to model the situation. A super important component of it is then to have students summarize the key math knowledge from that lesson. This often includes how math was able to help them solve a particular situation. To help build coherence and to have students make the connections, they also reflect on the lesson. At this point, this is where they can ask any wondering questions, record any ahas they had, maybe things that might still be puzzling to them, or just a chance to make some important connections.
Thanks, Amy. Those were some really great examples of what mathematical modeling looks like at the elementary level. And we included Amy's math journal template, that's what you see on the screen right now in your handout. So those of you that are elementary school teachers, we hope you'll be able to make use of that. So let's shift now to thinking about modeling with mathematics from a secondary perspective. I'm excited to have Karen McPherson joining us.
Hi, everyone. It is great to be with you tonight. So I'm a high school math coach in Asheville, North Carolina, and I work with teachers to implement effective teaching practices. I work with them on content knowledge and curriculum resources. I spent 13 years in the classroom teaching students and have been coaching for about 6 years now. And as I started working with teachers, one of the practices we found most challenging to implement was modeling with mathematics. So I reached out to some of my teachers and asked them what I could share tonight to help you as you also think about modeling with mathematics. So the first big aha that my teacher shared is that there is a subtle difference between modeling the mathematics versus modeling with mathematics. It's a simple change in one word that really caught our attention. At first, when we thought about modeling, it was about using manipulatives like algebra tiles or using concepts such as linear regression to model data. When you switch to thinking about modeling with mathematics, the ideas begin to evolve to think about the types of problems that can be solved, finance or design. This is what Sarah was sharing earlier when she talked about the modeling task is about modeling the world with the mathematics in order to solve a problem. The next big aha that my teacher shared was that the task must be presented so that students bring the math to the problem. They learn to be cautious not to overly scaffold the task by telling them what math to use or how to approach it. By providing too much structure, students end up following a prescribed process instead of thinking for themselves and modeling for themselves. So the aha was to keep it open. Working in high school, we often have to be mindful to not undermine the complexity of the task. In the design of your task, there are options that you can add information as students ask for it. You can also be selective in what you provide and what they've got to grapple with in terms of estimating or assuming. But the big thing was that students have to bring the math to the problem. It's not provided for them. The last aha I'd like to share is to just try it. Be willing to do what it is you want your students to do. Try something new. Think of solutions. Be creative and exhibit perseverance. Find a colleague who's willing to work with you on this practice. You may not get it perfect the first time, but with mindful planning and an understanding of what this practice looks, sounds, and feels like, you can definitely provide students with rich tasks where they model with mathematics.
Thank you, Karen. Really appreciate your perspective as well. All right, so we have time now to offer up your questions for our guests. If there's something that you would like to ask of Sarah or Amy or Karen, or for any of them to answer, please go ahead and just type your questions in the question box. And Karen, I saw a question that came out a little bit earlier in the webinar that I want to ask you, and that's, what do you do when the task that you have for the lesson doesn't really allow for those multiple entry points, and it doesn't really lend itself? What do you do then?
When we begin to look at certain problems that we may want to use for modeling, we strip the problem completely down with all of the numbers and the information and just start with the context. Very similar to what Sarah showed us with the diving problem. She didn't have any numbers in there. There were some quantities sort of hidden in there, but they weren't really prevalent. Then as we began to think about how students might approach, we think about what hints or information could we provide if the students ask for it that would give them those entry points. Some students won't ask for anything and they'll go and find what they need, but others may need some of that information. So that's one way to approach it.
Awesome, thank you. Sarah and Amy, I wonder if you guys could chime in on some resources that you use to find good mathematical modeling problems, aside from Achieve the Core, of course.
Yeah, Joni, I'd love to come in. So there's some great resources that are out there, aside from Achieve the Core, of course. I think one of our participants earlier mentioned 3-act tasks. They're a great resource that I love to use and pull like Act 3 and use that to help me come up with some different tasks and questions. And there's some other great places that I'll let Amy jump in and answer as well. I don't want to take everything away from her.
No, but those 3-act tasks really can be powerful because it's starting the situation without any of the numbers involved and really trying to get the students to make sense of the situation. So I think those are perfect for modeling. In addition to that, I also rely heavily on the conceptual-based tasks from Learn Zillion. They are written by teachers and highly vetted to make sure that they're really going to get to the heart of the lessons while not diminishing the thinking involved on the parts of the students. But if you're looking for those tasks, make sure you do so before July 1st because they are going to be changing their policies on their website. Another fabulous source for tasks is Illustrative Mathematics. I love the fact that they're very easy to take, and then you can even change so that you include your own students' names in those tasks if you want to try and make it more relevant, but another great resource for some very rich tasks.
Awesome, thank you. Amy, I think I'm going to direct this one back to you as well. Some people are asking about, particularly at the elementary level, how often do you do mathematical modeling tasks and how much time do you spend on them? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely, and that is a great question that over the years I've really had to try and refine what my math block even looks like and try to strike that balance. So again, trying to follow that arc of beginning with a conceptual-based lesson where the kids are really engaged and involved with the learning prior to being taught, then following that with some more procedural influency practice, and an application lesson is pretty much the flow I try to follow. So during a given week, there might be 2 to 3 days where they're engaged in that type of task. And then typically, depending on any type of formative or quick exit ticket, I can form some smaller instructional-based groups to work with on the subsequent days.
Great, thanks. Karen, could you chime in on that question from a high school perspective? How often, how much time does this take? How does that fit into the overall curriculum?
You certainly have to strike a balance. And it can come at different times, but it really works well if students have had some mathematics that they've been grappling with for a while, but they haven't quite gotten all the way there. So I'm thinking of a unit of study about 2/3 of the way in where they've had some time to look at the concept and get some practice in. A good math modeling task is great to put in about that time so that students can begin to see the bigger picture of where that fits in.
Perfect. I'm seeing several of you in the questions box asking for the websites and the specific resources. We'll include those in the materials that we send out afterwards with some direct links to the 3-act math tasks that were mentioned, Learn Zillion, Illustrative Mathematics. We'll share all of those. So if you didn't catch it, we'll grab those for you. All right, a couple more questions. I've seen a couple along the theme, and for any of you to answer, how do you support students when they're not used to grappling with the mathematics in this way? Are there questioning techniques? What are things that you can do as a teacher? And related to that, how do you help teachers who maybe aren't used to they're used to over scaffolding. They're used to really providing a lot of supports for students, which we know takes away the whole idea of mathematical modeling. So could one or two of you talk about those ideas?
Yeah, I'll take the first chance at it. Because working with teachers, sometimes they're hesitant to try out these ideas. And so one of the things we have as an entry point for teachers and for students, consider like an Algebra 1 class. We'll actually design a task in which the mathematics that the students are using is mathematics from the middle grades. And this will give them some confidence in the math in which they're using, but the learning experience is about how to persevere and how to think about modeling and how to make some of those assumptions. So using some mathematics from the prior grade could help people become more comfortable in the process.
I definitely agree with Karen. I think as you're starting this process, if you really focus on allowing the students to bring the math they know and making the task appropriate for that, then they'll come more willing. But some other things that I've done and used in that same mentality, like Karen talked about earlier, taking away the numbers. There are times when I've hidden the numbers in the problem and I just put the problem up. Maybe also kind of taking out that question at the end and just asking students what do they notice and what do they wonder about the context that's in front of them. That's another great way to get them into it and thinking and scaffolding that question up. But then also kind of chunking the problem for them and giving them opportunities to share with other groups, with other teams that are reflecting on a similar task, and just seeing how they're doing it and approaching it. It definitely helps to give students those opportunities to interact with each other and get different perspectives.
And just one more area I would like to add is the importance of questioning. I think that was the game changer for me when I recognized just the power of asking the focusing questions without it being so spoon-fed for students. And there's a great resource on that Align blog regarding some questions that are specific to each of the math practice standards, and that's my go-to guide. I have that with me. I hold it in my hands just in case I get stuck, just trying to make sure that I'm not going to give too much away to the students, but still allow them to participate and engage even if they are struggling with it.
Thanks, Amy. I'll include that Aligned blog and the list of questions you were talking about in the resources as well. I see people like, wait, what was that again? What was that again? We'll include that. So go ahead, Jenny. I think you had other questions.
Yeah, I saw one question come in, or related questions, several of them, about how to have these types of rich tasks and modeling problems in classrooms where you have a good number of English language learners. And so I wondered if any of you have experience with that and how to help when there might be problems with the language or with the context of the problem. But I also wanted to give a quick plug before one of you answers for our April webinar, which is around how to help English language learners access college and career ready content. So our math and literacy teams at Student Achievement Partners are working on some adaptations to some of our tools to account for English language learners and their developing language. But I wondered if any of you core advocates who are on the webinar tonight have some suggestions around how to structure class so that English language learners can also access these rich problems.
Yeah, I'll take the first crack at this one. I think the biggest thing is knowing your audience and knowing the context that you're presenting. So if you're reflecting on that as you're doing the problem in advance and thinking that there might be something contextually that's going to be a barrier or stumbling block for the students, kind of being ready for that ahead of time and asking them, do they know what this means? Or, get them into that space in terms of the vocabulary around the context versus the vocabulary around the math. Perfect example, I remember one of the groups in one of my classes when we were doing a task, they had to create a plan for an ice cream truck. But for them, that wasn't contextually relevant because they didn't know what an ice cream truck was. And they were like, can we make it a taco truck? And I was like, sure, why not? Let's make it a taco truck. And then for my other classes, it became a taco truck because that was something that they related to more. A very simple example, but giving them the ownership of that and making it relevant to them is definitely a big one. But then also using the strategies that you use with language learners in other content areas as well. What are some reading strategies that are available? What are, some different techniques to kind of chunk that text up is also really important. So a good strategy that a few of my colleagues use is the read and flip, where they have students read the problem and then flip it over and write down everything that they remembered or that they noticed, and they do that multiple times to help them key in on different quantities or different tasks, different contextual items as part of the problem. Also, 3 read strategies or multiple read strategies are really helpful and useful as well.
And I'll just add quickly in addition to that.
Oh, go ahead, Amy.
Sure. Having students working collaboratively together with a task or situation, the kids tend to act that out. So if a ELL student is struggling with the language, it's really cute to watch the kids really just try to explain the situation using pantomime and relating it to them. Then by recording it in their journals and having those anchor charts, that helps link the language that the students are using to that visual that doesn't go away. That's one thing why I have tried to invest in chart paper and use that old technology, because it's not something that just kind of disappears. It's still something referenced that they can go back and check if they didn't quite catch it that first time, that's still something visible for them to use.
Great, thank you so much. Oh, go ahead, Karen.
Yeah, I was just going to add some of my newest learning has been the mathematical language routines out of Stanford. So if you get a chance, you might want to check those out, and I'm sure they're probably going to be a part of next month's webinar.
Absolutely, they're definitely a part of the materials and work that our math team is doing, but I will also have Joni include that in the materials and resources list that will come with this webinar and the materials for the webinar, because the mathematical language routines are great and definitely a resource that everyone should look at. So thank you so much. It's so wonderful to have 3 core advocates on the webinar tonight who are speaking from experience in their classrooms and schools and are such experts in working with students and teachers. So thank you so much to the 3 of you for joining us this evening. We really appreciate it. If you found tonight's webinar helpful, we'd like to invite you to join our Core Advocate Network. Many of you are probably already in the network, but if you're not, you should know that we're committed to solving real problems that real teachers have, and we know the best way to do this is to know more about what folks are experiencing. So we'd love to learn about who you are and where you work and the types of things you're interested in and the expertise you already have. This way we'll be able to tailor our webinars and other opportunities to your needs and interests, and we actually may even tap you to be our next webinar panelist. So we encourage you to join the network by filling out the survey that can be found at achievethecore.org/CA sign up, core advocate -sign up. Additionally, we'd like to invite all core advocates to share what they're doing more broadly with us, whether it's trying out a new strategy or a tool, maybe something that you learned on the webinar tonight. We'd like to know how it went and how you're using it or what you're doing with it. So please let us know about your advocacy with our instructional advocacy action form. And again, the URL for that is also at achievethecore.org/educators-taking-action. And we have another math-focused webinar next month for you. So we hope you'll join us to learn about our work making materials better, specifically the Materials Alignment Project with the K-5 Envision 2.0 math curriculum. So when you receive the materials from tonight's webinar, all of the hyperlinks will be live. So just click on this hyperlink on this slide to register for next month's webinar. And I know I don't have a slide about it on here, but because we had such a rich discussion, our April webinar is on helping English language learners access college and career ready content. So we hope you will join us for that one as well. And our webinars are always the first Wednesday of each month at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So thank you again for joining us. We had a really great, rich discussion. I tried to share out as many of the question responses as I could. We hope that it was as rich for all of you as it was for us, and an evening filled with learning. And we hope to see you again on another webinar in the future. Have a good evening, everyone.